This is Craziest HOA Moments. The cover-up was louder than the original incident. You are going to stop wasting your own time. That was Ann White, standing on my driveway in Cleveland at 7 in the morning, waving a violation notice like it was a warrant. She had just told me I owed the Aspen Hollow HOA $200 for a guest parking violation from 3 nights ago, and she had a witness list to prove it. When I asked to see the list, she folded the notice into her jacket pocket and said witnesses were confidential until the hearing. I work as a gym manager with early morning open shifts, and I had exactly 20 minutes before I needed to be on the road. Ann knew that. She always knew that. She smiled when she said I could contest it at the next board meeting in 2 weeks, but the fine was due in 7 days. I looked at the puddles on my driveway from last night's rain, and I could see fresh tire tracks at the curb where someone had pulled up recently. Ann was still talking, saying something about mailbox announcements and compliance standards, but I was already thinking about the old case. 3 years ago, someone in this neighborhood reported missing money from a special assessment fund, and the complaint vanished from the meeting minutes 2 months later. The homeowner who filed it moved out quietly. No one ever mentioned it again. Until now, because the notice Ann just handed me had the same template, the same formatting, and the same enforcement coordinator signature as the notices from that old case. I had seen those notices before. I had a copy of one in my filing cabinet, and I was about to pull it out. Ann stepped closer, holding up a megaphone she liked to carry around for what she called mailbox announcements. She was wearing a purple light jacket with a gray sun hat, and her red hair was pulled back in a sleek low ponytail that made her look like she was ready for a courtroom drama. She pointed the megaphone at my chest and said the HOA had already contacted the tow vendor, and if I did not move my car to the correct spot by noon, the tow would be authorized. I asked what correct spot she meant, because my car was in my own driveway. She said guest vehicles had been parking in front of my house during restricted hours, and as the homeowner, I was responsible for their compliance. I asked for the dates and times. She said that information was in the witness statements, and I would receive them after I paid the fine or attended the hearing, whichever came first. I told her that sounded like she was holding evidence hostage. She smiled again and said if I wanted mercy, I should move somewhere without an HOA. That was her catchphrase, and she used it every time someone questioned a fine. I had heard her say it at least 6 times in the past year. I pulled out my phone and opened the calendar. 3 nights ago, I had a service appointment at my house for HVAC work. The contractor arrived at 6 in the evening and stayed until 8. His truck was parked on the street in front of my driveway, exactly where guest parking was allowed according to the rules I had reviewed when I bought the house. Ann saw me scrolling and said the rules had been updated last month. I asked where the update was posted. She said it was in the newsletter. I said I never received a newsletter. She said that was my problem, not hers. Then she turned and walked back toward the mailbox cluster, calling over her shoulder that the 7-day clock started today. I went inside and grabbed the old notice from my filing cabinet. It was in a plastic sleeve, folded once, and it had the same enforcement coordinator signature as the new notice. The old notice was dated 3 years ago, addressed to a neighbor who no longer lived here, and it listed a parking violation during restricted hours. The restricted hours listed on that notice were midnight to 6 in the morning. The new notice Ann just handed me listed restricted hours as 6 in the evening to midnight. I held both notices up to the window and compared the signatures. They were identical, down to the loop in the capital W. The old notice had a creation date in the metadata when I scanned it into my computer 3 years ago, and that creation date was 2 weeks after the enforcement date printed on the notice itself. Someone had backdated it. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I logged into the Aspen Hollow HOA portal and searched for the policy updates from last month. There were no updates. The parking policy section still showed the same revision date from 2 years ago, and the restricted hours were still listed as midnight to 6 in the morning. Anne had lied about the update, and she had handed me a backdated notice with hours that did not match the current policy. I took a photo of both notices side by side. Then I took a screenshot of the portal showing the parking policy with the timestamp visible. I saved everything into a folder labeled Cold Case Reopen and sent a copy to my personal email. Then I checked the time. I had 10 minutes to get to work. I made it to the gym on time, but barely. My first client was already waiting in the lobby, and I had to unlock the doors while still thinking about the notice in my jacket pocket. During my break, I called the HOA management company and asked to speak to someone about an enforcement question. The receptionist put me on hold for 8 minutes, then transferred me to a compliance coordinator named Steve. I told Steve I had received a parking violation notice that listed restricted hours different from the policy posted on the portal. Steve asked for my address and my account number. I gave him both. He put me on hold again, and I could hear keyboard clicks in the background. When he came back, he said my account showed no open violations. I told him I was holding the notice in my hand. He asked me to read the notice number. I read it. He said that notice number did not exist in the system. I asked him to repeat that. He said the notice number I just read was not in the database, and if I wanted to dispute a violation, I needed to submit a formal records request. I asked how long that took. He said 10 business days. I said the notice gave me 7 days to pay. He said that sounded like an internal board matter and I should contact the board directly. I asked if he could connect me to the board president. He said board contact information was not provided to homeowners outside of scheduled meetings. Then he thanked me for calling and hung up. I stood in the gym hallway, staring at my phone. The notice in my hand did not exist in the system. That meant Anne had printed it herself, signed it herself, and delivered it herself without logging it through the management company. That was a violation of the enforcement policy I had reviewed when I moved in. Every violation notice had to be entered into the system before delivery, and every notice had to include an appeal process with a timeline. This notice had neither. I pulled up the enforcement policy document I had saved on my phone and scrolled to the section on notice procedures. Step 1 was a warning letter. Step 2 was a formal notice with a 14-day cure period. Step 3 was a hearing. Anne had skipped steps 1 and 2 entirely, and she had shortened the cure period to 7 days. I took another screenshot and added it to the folder. Then I went back to work and finished my shift, but I kept thinking about the witness list Anne had mentioned. If she had witnesses, where were they? If the violation happened 3 nights ago, who was watching my house at 6 in the evening on a weeknight? I did not recognize any neighbors who would care about contractor parking, and I had never received a complaint before. When I got home that evening, I checked my doorbell camera footage. The camera faced the street, and it recorded motion-triggered clips with timestamps. I scrolled back to 3 nights ago and found the clip from 6:15 in the evening. The HVAC contractor's truck pulled up and parked on the street. 2 minutes later, the contractor walked up my driveway carrying a toolbox. At 6:43, a silver sedan pulled up across the street and idled for 30 seconds. The driver leaned forward and looked at my porch, and I could see the shape of someone holding a phone up toward my door. The driver's face was partially visible in the streetlight reflection. It was Anne. She was documenting my contractor's truck, and she was looking directly at my doorbell camera when she did it. I saved the clip and added it to the folder. The next morning, I printed everything and put it in a ring binder with highlighted sections. The binder had the old notice, the new notice, the policy screenshots, the portal timestamp, the doorbell clip stills, and the enforcement procedure document. I also printed the management company call log from my phone, showing the date, time, and duration of my call with Steve. I labeled the binder cold case evidence and put it in my car. Then I drove to the mailbox cluster where Anne liked to do her mailbox announcements. She was already there, standing next to the cluster with her megaphone and a stack of flyers. 3 neighbors were standing nearby pretending to check their mail but clearly listening. I parked and walked over with the binder under my arm. Anne saw me coming and raised the megaphone. She said I was in violation of the 7-day deadline and I needed to pay immediately or face additional penalties. I asked what additional penalties. She said a lien on my property and a towing authorization that would start today. I opened the binder and held it up so the neighbors could see. I said the notice she gave me did not exist in the HOA system. The restricted hours did not match the posted policy, and the enforcement steps were skipped. Anne lowered the megaphone and said I was wasting everyone's time with paperwork games. I said I had a doorbell clip showing her surveilling my house the same night she claimed a violation occurred. One of the neighbors, a guy named Tom who had lived here longer than anyone, stepped closer and asked to see the binder. I handed it to him. He flipped through the pages, stopped on the side-by-side notices, and looked at Anne. He said the old notice was from the Mueller case 3 years ago, and he remembered that case because the Muellers moved out right after the complaint disappeared. Anne said that case was closed and irrelevant. Tom said it looked pretty relevant if the same person was signing backdated notices now. Anne grabbed for the binder, but Tom pulled it back and kept reading. She said Tom had no authority to review internal enforcement documents. Tom said these were not internal, they were public notices delivered to homeowners, and any homeowner had the right to compare them. Another neighbor, a woman named Linda, walked over and asked what was going on. Tom handed her the binder and pointed to the restricted hours mismatch. Linda read it, looked at Anne, and said she had never heard of restricted hours changing. Anne said the board had approved the change in a closed session. Linda asked when. Anne said last month. Linda said she was at last month's meeting, and there was no vote on parking hours. Anne said it was a compliance adjustment, not a policy change, and compliance adjustments did not require a vote. Tom said that sounded like something someone made up to avoid a vote. Anne's face turned red, and she raised the megaphone again. She said I was disrupting the neighborhood, and if I did not leave immediately, she would call the sheriff. I said I would be happy to wait for the sheriff, because I had a lot of questions about backdated notices. Anne lowered the megaphone and walked to her car without another word. The neighbors watched her leave, then Tom handed the binder back to me. He said he had a copy of the old Mueller complaint somewhere in his files, and if I wanted it, he would dig it out. I said I wanted it. He said he would drop it off tonight. Linda asked if I was planning to fight this. I said I was planning to reopen the cold case and connect every piece. She smiled and said she would be at the next board meeting to watch. That evening, Tom knocked on my door with a manila folder. Inside was a printed email thread from 3 years ago between him and another neighbor, discussing the Mueller complaint about missing special assessment funds. The email included a scanned copy of the original complaint form the Muellers had submitted, and it listed Ann White as the person responsible for managing the special assessment account. The complaint claimed that $5,000 collected for neighborhood landscaping had never been spent, and the accounting records were incomplete. The Muellers had requested an audit. 2 months later, the complaint was removed from the meeting minutes, and the Muellers moved out. Tom said he never got a straight answer about what happened, and eventually everyone stopped asking. He said Ann had been on the board for 6 years, and she had been special assessment coordinator for 4 of those years. I asked if anyone else had complained about enforcement or missing money. Tom said a few people had questioned fines, but they all dropped it after Ann threatened liens or legal action. He said Ann had a cozy relationship with a tow vendor named Blue Line Towing, and she used them for every vehicle enforcement case. I asked if Blue Line Towing had a contract with the HOA. Tom said he did not think so, but Ann always called them first. I added the email thread to the binder and thanked Tom. He said if I needed a witness at the board meeting, he would show up. I said I might need more than that. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA. The envelope had a return address for Aspen Hollow HOA Incorporated, and it was signed for delivery. Inside was a notice of hearing, scheduled for 5 days from now. The hearing notice listed 3 violations: unauthorized guest parking, failure to comply with enforcement notice, and disruptive behavior at the mailbox cluster. The fine total was now $600, and the notice said my car would be towed within 24 hours if I did not attend the hearing. I took a photo of the envelope, the notice, and the certified mail receipt. Then I called the management company again and asked to speak to Steve. The receptionist said Steve was unavailable. I asked when he would be available. She said she could not provide that information. I asked to speak to his supervisor. She put me on hold for 12 minutes, then transferred me to a voicemail box. I left a message explaining that I had received a hearing notice for violations that were not in the system, and I needed a records request expedited. I said I had evidence of backdated notices and skipped enforcement steps. I gave my contact information and asked for a call back within 24 hours. No one called back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and went through the timeline. 3 years ago, the Muellers filed a complaint about missing special assessment funds. Anne was managing the account. 2 months later, the complaint disappeared and the Muellers moved. 3 nights ago, my HVAC contractor parked on the street during allowed hours. Anne surveilled my house and documented the parking. The next morning, she delivered a backdated notice with fabricated restricted hours. When I questioned it, she escalated to a $600 fine and a tow threat. The management company refused to acknowledge the violations in the system. The enforcement steps were skipped. The hearing notice was delivered by certified mail to create a paper trail, but the violations themselves were not logged anywhere. That meant Anne was running a parallel enforcement system outside the official process, and she was using it to collect fees that never went into the HOA account. I opened my laptop and searched for Blue Line Towing. Their website listed services, rates, and contact information. I called the main number and asked if they had a contract with Aspen Hollow HOA. The dispatcher said they had an ongoing relationship with a board member who called them for vehicle removals. I asked how often. The dispatcher said at least once a month. I asked if the board member's name was Ann White. The dispatcher paused, then said he could not provide that information. I thanked him and hung up. Then I pulled up the HOA financial disclosures from the past 3 years. They were posted on the portal under transparency documents. I downloaded all of them and opened the special assessment section. The landscaping fund showed $5,000 collected 3 years ago and $5,000 spent 3 years ago with a line item labeled vendor services. There was no vendor name, no invoice, and no breakdown. I cross-referenced it with the meeting minutes from the same time period. The minutes mentioned the landscaping project, but they never mentioned the vendor or the completion date. The project was never completed. The money vanished. I printed the financial disclosures and added them to the binder. The binder was now thick enough that I needed a second set of tabs. I labeled the sections Old Case, New Case, Enforcement Violations, and Financial Evidence. Then I drafted a formal records request and sent it to the management company, asking for all enforcement notices issued in my name, all special assessment accounting records from the past 4 years, and all meeting minutes related to parking policy changes. I sent the request by email with a read receipt and by certified mail with tracking. I kept copies of everything. The hearing was in 4 days. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail from Anne. She said the board had reviewed my case and they were offering a one-time settlement option. If I paid $300 by the end of the day, they would dismiss the disruptive behavior charge and reduce the parking fines. If I did not pay, the tow would proceed at noon tomorrow, and the full $600 would be due immediately. She said this was my last chance to resolve it quietly. I saved the voicemail and added the timestamp to my notes. Then I called my attorney. I had consulted with her a year ago on a contract issue, and I still had her contact information. Her name was Rebecca, and she answered on the second ring. I explained the situation, backdated notices, skipped enforcement steps, missing violations in the system, a cold case involving missing funds, and a tow threat. Rebecca asked if I had documentation. I said I had a binder. She said bring it to her office in an hour. I grabbed the binder and left. Rebecca's office was in a small building near downtown Cleveland. She met me in the lobby and took me to a conference room. I opened the binder and walked her through the timeline. She took notes, flipped through the pages, and stopped on the side-by-side notices. She said the backdated notice was a problem, and the skipped enforcement steps were a bigger problem. She said the HOA enforcement policy was part of the governing documents, and any deviation from the policy without a recorded vote was a breach. She asked if I had proof the violations were not in the system. I showed her the call log and the screenshots. She asked if the management company had responded to my records request. I said no. She said that was also a problem, because Ohio law required HOAs to provide records within a reasonable time frame. She asked if I was willing to escalate. I said I was willing to do whatever it took to stop Ann from running a fake enforcement system. Rebecca said she would draft a demand letter to the HOA and the management company, asking for immediate production of records, suspension of the tow order, and a formal response to the enforcement violations. She said the letter would cite the governing documents, Ohio Revised Code, and the potential for legal action if they did not comply. She said it would take her 2 hours to draft it, and she would send it by the end of the day. I asked how much it would cost. She said $500 for the letter and the initial consultation. I said do it. I took the notice without flinching, because I knew what it would trigger. Rebecca sent the demand letter that afternoon. It went to the HOA board president, the management company, and Ann White individually. The letter was 4 pages long, and it included citations, a timeline, and a request for response within 48 hours. It also included a warning that any retaliatory action, including towing, would be considered evidence of bad faith and would be included in any future litigation. I received a copy by email, and Rebecca said she would follow up with certified mail tracking. I thanked her and went home. That evening, I checked my email every 20 minutes. At 8:30, I received a message from the management company. The message was from Steve, the compliance coordinator I had spoken to earlier. He said he had received the demand letter, and he was forwarding my case to the legal department for review. He said the records request would be processed within 10 business days, and the tow order had been suspended pending review. He said the hearing scheduled in 3 days was also postponed until the legal review was complete. I forwarded the message to Rebecca. She replied with one word, "Good." Then I checked the doorbell camera footage from earlier that day. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a Blue Line towing truck had pulled up in front of my house and idled for 2 minutes. The driver got out, walked to my driveway, took a photo of my car, and walked back to the truck. Then the truck left. I saved the clip and added it to the binder. The next day, I received another certified letter. This one was from Ann, and it was not on HOA letterhead. It was a personal letter, typed on plain paper, and it said I was harassing her with false accusations. It said she had documented my behavior at the mailbox cluster, and she had witness statements from multiple neighbors confirming I was disruptive and aggressive. It said if I continued to spread false information, she would pursue a defamation claim. The letter was not signed. I took a photo and sent it to Rebecca. She called me 10 minutes later and said the letter was a bluff. She said defamation required proof of false statements and damages, and I had not made any public statements beyond showing documentation to neighbors. She said the unsigned letter was also a red flag, because it showed Ann was acting outside her official role. Rebecca said she would add the letter to her file and include it in any future correspondence. Then she asked if I had any other evidence I had not shown her yet. I said I had a doorbell clip of Ann surveilling my house, and I had financial disclosures showing missing special assessment funds with no vendor name. Rebecca said bring everything to her office tomorrow morning. She said we were going to build a case that the HOA could not ignore. That night, Tom knocked on my door again. He had another folder, this one with meeting minutes from 3 years ago. He said he had searched his email and found the archived minutes from the month the Mueller complaint disappeared. The minutes listed the complaint as pending under new business, and they included a note that Ann had requested a closed session to discuss sensitive financial matters. The closed session was listed, but no details were recorded. The following month's minutes made no mention of the complaint, the closed session, or the Muellers. Tom said he remembered asking about it at the time, and Ann had told him the matter was resolved privately. He said he never saw any resolution, and the Muellers moved out 2 weeks later. I asked if anyone on the board had questioned it. Tom said one board member, a guy named Richard, had asked for the closed session notes to be added to the record. Ann had said closed session notes were confidential. Richard had pushed back, and Ann had called for a vote to exclude him from future closed sessions. The vote passed, and Richard resigned from the board a month later. I added the minutes to the binder and asked Tom if Richard still lived in the neighborhood. Tom said he did, 2 streets over. I asked if Tom could introduce me. Tom said he would text Richard tonight. The next morning, I met Rebecca at her office with the updated binder. She reviewed the new evidence, including the meeting minutes and the doorbell clip. She said the closed session was a major red flag, because Ohio law required closed sessions to have documented justifications, and financial disputes did not qualify unless they involved pending litigation. She said the lack of follow-up minutes suggested the closed session was used to bury the complaint without a formal resolution. She asked if I had contacted Richard yet. I said Tom was setting up a meeting. Rebecca said Richard's testimony would be critical because he was a former board member who witnessed the suppression firsthand. She said if Richard was willing to provide a statement, we could use it to show a pattern of retaliation and misconduct. Then, Rebecca said she had received a response from the HOA's legal department. The response was brief. It said the records request was being processed, the hearing postponement was confirmed, and the tow order was suspended. It also said the board would be conducting an internal review of enforcement procedures. Rebecca said the internal review was a stalling tactic, but it also meant they were worried. She said we should keep the pressure on. That afternoon, Tom texted me Richard's phone number. I called Richard and introduced myself. He remembered the Mueller case immediately. He said Ann had controlled the board for years, and anyone who questioned her was pushed out. He said the closed session 3 years ago was the breaking point for him. He had asked to see the accounting records for the Special Assessment Fund, and Ann had refused. When he pressed the issue, Ann had called him disruptive and accused him of undermining the board. He said the vote to exclude him from closed sessions was a setup, and he resigned because he knew he could not win. I asked if he had any documentation from that time. He said he had emails, meeting notes, and a resignation letter he never sent. He said he would send me copies if it would help. I said it would help a lot. He said he would email them tonight. Then he asked what I was planning to do. I said I was planning to reopen the cold case and force an audit. He said good luck, and if I needed him to testify, he would do it. I thanked him and hung up. Then I checked my email. Richard had already sent the files. I downloaded them and opened the resignation letter. It was 3 pages long, and it detailed every instance of retaliation, procedural manipulation, and financial obstruction he had witnessed during his time on the board. It named Ann specifically, and it included dates, meeting references, and direct quotes. I printed it and added it to the binder. The next day, I received a call from Steve at the management company. He said the legal department had completed their preliminary review, and they wanted to schedule a meeting with me to discuss the case. He said the meeting would include a representative from the legal department and a board liaison. He did not say if Ann would be there. I asked when. He said tomorrow at 10 in the morning at the management company office. I said I would be there, and I asked if I could bring my attorney. He paused, then said that was my right. I called Rebecca and told her about the meeting. She said she would meet me there. Then I spent the rest of the day organizing the binder into a presentation order. I added a summary sheet at the front with bullet points, backdated notices, skipped enforcement steps, missing financial records, closed session irregularities, and a pattern of retaliation. I printed extra copies of the key documents in case they asked to keep anything. I also printed the blue line towing doorbell clip stills and added them to a section labeled Vendor Coordination. By the time I finished, the binder was 2 inches thick. The management company office was in a strip mall near the highway. I arrived 15 minutes early with Rebecca. We checked in at the front desk and the receptionist led us to a conference room. 3 people were already inside. Steve, a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as the legal department director, and a man in his 50s who said he was the board liaison. Anne was not there. The legal director started by thanking me for coming, and she said the HOA took enforcement concerns seriously. She said they had reviewed my records request, and they were prepared to provide some of the documents today. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed copies of the parking policy, the enforcement procedure document, and the meeting minutes from the past 6 months. None of the minutes mentioned parking policy changes. I asked about the violations in my name. She said there were no violations in the system. I asked about the notice Anne had delivered. She said the notice was not issued through the management company, and the board was investigating how it was created. Rebecca asked if Anne had the authority to issue notices outside the system. The legal director said no. Rebecca asked if the HOA had a contract with Blue Line Towing. The board liaison said they did not. Rebecca asked how many times Blue Line Towing had been called in the past year. The legal director said she would need to check the records. Rebecca said we already had evidence of at least 12 calls, and we had a doorbell clip showing a Blue Line truck at my house the same day the tow order was supposedly suspended. The legal director's expression changed. She asked to see the clip. I opened my laptop and played it. The room went silent. The board liaison leaned forward and said he was not aware of any tow order being issued after the suspension. Steve looked at the legal director and said he had confirmed the suspension in writing. The legal director asked if I had any other evidence of coordination between Anne and the tow vendor. I opened the binder and showed her the call log summary I had created, with dates, times, and case references. She took notes. Then Rebecca asked about the special assessment fund from 3 years ago. The legal director said that was outside the scope of the current review. Rebecca said it was directly relevant because it established a pattern of financial irregularities and retaliation. She slid Richard's resignation letter across the table. The legal director read it, and her face tightened. She said she would need to escalate this to the full board. Rebecca said we expected a formal response within 7 days, and if the response did not include a plan to address the violations, we would file a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General and pursue legal action. The legal director said she understood. The meeting ended. On the drive home, Rebecca said the meeting went better than expected. She said the legal director's reaction to the tow vendor evidence was a sign they were worried about liability. She said if Anne had been coordinating with Blue Line Towing without board approval, that was a breach of fiduciary duty, and the HOA could be held responsible. She also said Richard's resignation letter was a smoking gun because it showed the board had been aware of financial issues 3 years ago and had chosen to ignore them. Rebecca said the next step was to wait for the formal response, and if the response was inadequate, we would file a complaint and request an audit. She said Ohio law allowed homeowners to petition for an independent audit if they suspected financial misconduct, and we had enough evidence to meet the threshold. I asked how long that would take. She said 30 to 60 days. I said I could wait. Then I went home and checked my email. There was a message from Tom. It said Linda had talked to 3 other neighbors, and all of them had received questionable fines from Anne in the past 2 years. 2 of them had paid to avoid hassle, and 1 had moved out. Tom said if I was building a case, he could get statements from the neighbors who paid. I replied and said yes. That evening I received a call from an unknown number. I answered, and it was Anne. She said we needed to talk. I said I was happy to talk with my attorney present. She said this was not a legal matter, it was a neighborhood matter, and I was making it worse by involving lawyers. I said she had escalated it by issuing fake notices and coordinating with the tow vendor. She said the notices were real, and the tow vendor was a standard contractor. I said the management company confirmed the notices were not in the system, and the HOA had no contract with Blue Line Towing. She went quiet for a moment, then said I was twisting the facts. I said I had documentation, and I was prepared to share it with the entire neighborhood if necessary. She said if I did that, I would regret it. I said that sounded like a threat. She said it was a warning, and she had a committee backing her. I said I had an attorney, a former board member, and multiple neighbors willing to testify. Then I hung up. I saved the call log and added it to the binder. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, hit the like button and subscribe for more neighbor drama stories. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was a courier with another certified letter. The envelope was from the HOA, and it was addressed to me and marked urgent. Inside was a notice of special meeting, scheduled for 3 days from now. The agenda listed one item: discussion and vote on enforcement policy compliance and homeowner conduct. The notice said attendance was mandatory for all homeowners with open violations. I did not have any open violations, but I knew Anne was trying to force a confrontation in a controlled setting. I called Rebecca and read her the notice. She said it was a setup, and the mandatory attendance language was not enforceable. She said I should attend anyway, because it was an opportunity to present the evidence in front of the full board and other homeowners. She said she would attend as my representative. I said thank you. Then I called Tom and told him about the meeting. He said he would be there, and he would bring Linda and anyone else he could rally. He said Anne was going to try to control the narrative, but if enough neighbors showed up, she would lose the room. I said I hoped he was right. The day before the meeting, I received the formal response from the legal department. It was a 2-page letter, and it acknowledged that the notices I received were not issued through proper channels. It said the board was taking corrective action, and Ann White was being removed from her role as enforcement coordinator pending further review. It said the parking fines were dismissed, and the tow order was permanently rescinded. It also said the board would be conducting a financial audit of the Special Assessment Fund, and the results would be shared with homeowners within 60 days. The letter ended with an apology for the confusion and a commitment to improving transparency. Rebecca called me after she received her copy. She said it was a significant win, but it was not over. She said the audit was the critical piece because it would confirm the missing funds and establish Anne's liability. She said we should still attend the meeting tomorrow and make sure the board followed through. I agreed. Then I printed the response letter and added it to the binder. The special meeting was held in the clubhouse near the neighborhood entrance. I arrived early with Rebecca, and the room was already filling up. Tom and Linda were there, along with at least 20 other neighbors I recognized. Richard was there too, sitting in the back row. Anne was at the front of the room, standing next to a table with a microphone and a gavel. She was wearing her purple jacket and her gray sun hat, and she had her megaphone on the table. The board president, a man named Carl, was sitting next to her with a folder. Carl called the meeting to order and read the agenda. He said the board had received complaints about enforcement procedures, and they wanted to address them in an open forum. Then he turned the microphone over to Anne. She stood up and said there had been a misunderstanding about recent notices, and the board was clarifying the process going forward. She said enforcement was necessary to maintain property values, and some homeowners were abusing the appeals process to avoid accountability. She looked directly at me when she said it. Then she said the board had reviewed my case, and they had determined that my violations were valid, but they were offering a settlement as a gesture of goodwill. Carl interrupted and said that was not accurate. He said the legal department had dismissed the violations, and there was no settlement offer. Anne's face turned red, and she picked up the megaphone. Carl reached over and took it from her. He said the microphone was sufficient. Then he asked if I wanted to address the board. I stood up and walked to the front with the binder. Rebecca stood next to me. I opened the binder and held it up so everyone could see. I said the notices I received were backdated, the enforcement steps were skipped, and the violations were never entered into the system. I said I had documentation showing Anne had coordinated with a tow vendor without board approval, and I had evidence of a pattern of retaliation going back 3 years. I showed the side-by-side notices, the doorbell clip stills, and the financial disclosures. Then I read a section of Richard's resignation letter where he described Anne refusing to provide accounting records and calling him disruptive for asking questions. Richard stood up in the back and confirmed it was true. The room went silent. Anne said I was lying, and she had witness statements proving the violations were real. I asked her to produce the witness statements. She said they were confidential. Carl said witness statements were not confidential if they were being used to justify fines. He asked Anne to provide them immediately. Anne said she did not have them with her. Carl asked when she would have them. Anne said she would email them to the board within a week. Carl said that was not acceptable, and the board would not consider any enforcement action without documented evidence. Then he asked if anyone else wanted to speak. Tom stood up and said he had received a questionable fine from Anne 2 years ago, and he had paid it to avoid hassle. He said he now believed the fine was fabricated, and he wanted a refund. Linda stood up and said the same thing. 3 other neighbors stood up and said they had similar experiences. Anne tried to interrupt, but Carl told her to sit down. He said the board would be reviewing all enforcement actions issued under her coordination, and any homeowner who believed they were wrongly fined could submit a refund request. Then he said the board had voted earlier that day to remove Anne from her role as enforcement coordinator, and she would no longer have authority to issue notices or coordinate with vendors. Anne stood up and said the board had no authority to remove her without a full vote. Carl said the vote had already happened, and it was recorded in the minutes. He handed her a copy. Anne read it, and her face went pale. Then she grabbed her megaphone and walked out of the room. Everyone watched her leave. Carl turned back to the microphone and said the meeting was adjourned. The room erupted in applause. After the meeting, Tom and Linda walked over and congratulated me. Tom said he had never seen Anne lose control like that, and it felt good to watch. Linda said she was going to submit a refund request for her fine, and she encouraged everyone else to do the same. Richard came over and shook my hand. He said he wished he had fought harder 3 years ago, but he was glad someone finally did. Rebecca said the meeting went exactly as she hoped, and the public vote to remove Anne was the final piece we needed. She said the audit would take a few weeks, but the outcome was already clear. I thanked her and said I could not have done it without her. She said she was happy to help, and she would send me a final invoice. Then I left the clubhouse and drove home. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw a notice taped to my front door. My heart sank for a moment, but when I got closer, I saw it was not a violation notice. It was a handwritten note from a neighbor I had never met. It said, "Thank you for standing up to Anne," and it was signed by someone named Karen. I laughed and saved the note. The next week, I received another letter from the management company. It included a formal apology from the board, a confirmation that all fines in my name were dismissed, and a check for $500 to cover my attorney fees. The letter also said the financial audit was underway, and preliminary findings showed discrepancies in the special assessment account. The board had retained an independent auditor, and the results would be shared at the next quarterly meeting. I deposited the check and sent a copy of the letter to Rebecca. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Then I checked the HOA portal. The enforcement policy had been updated with new language requiring all notices to be logged in the system before delivery, and all enforcement actions had to be approved by the board president. The updated policy also included a section on appeals with clear timelines and procedures. I saved a copy and added it to the binder. The binder was now a permanent record. 2 weeks later, Tom knocked on my door with another update. He said the audit results were in, and they were worse than anyone expected. The auditor had found that $5,000 from the Special Assessment Fund 3 years ago had been transferred to an account controlled by Anne, and the money was never returned. The auditor also found 12 instances of enforcement fines that were collected but never deposited into the HOA account. The total missing amount was over $8,000. The board had referred the findings to the local prosecutor, and Anne was under investigation for theft and fraud. Tom said Anne had not been seen in the neighborhood since the meeting, and her house was listed for sale. I asked if anyone had contacted the Muellers. Tom said Linda had tracked them down on social media, and they were considering filing a civil claim. I said they should. Tom said he thought so too. Then he asked if I was going to the next board meeting. I said I would not miss it. The next quarterly meeting was packed. Every seat in the clubhouse was filled and people were standing along the walls. Carl called the meeting to order and said the board had a lot to cover. He started with the audit results. He read the summary aloud, including the missing $5,000 and the 12 undeposited fines. He said the board had referred the case to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, and Ann White was no longer a member of the HOA board. He also said the board had voted to implement new financial controls, including quarterly audits and dual signature requirements for all account transactions. Then he opened the floor for comments. Richard stood up and said the board should have acted 3 years ago, and the current board owed the neighborhood an apology for allowing Ann to operate without oversight. Carl agreed, and he apologized on behalf of the board. Linda stood up and asked what would happen to the homeowners who paid questionable fines. Carl said the board was setting up a reimbursement process, and anyone who believed they were wrongly fined could submit a claim with documentation. I stood up and asked if the board was planning to review the relationship with Blue Line Towing. Carl said the board had already terminated the relationship, and they were soliciting bids from multiple vendors for future towing needs. The room applauded. Then Carl said the board was also planning to circulate a new set of enforcement guidelines for homeowner review, and they would hold a vote at the next meeting. He said transparency and accountability were the board's top priorities going forward. The meeting ended with more applause, and people came up to shake my hand and thank me. It felt good. A month later, I received a call from the prosecutor's office. They said Ann had been charged with theft and fraud, and they were preparing for trial. They said I might be called as a witness and they would keep me updated. I said I was ready. Then I asked what happened to the missing money. The prosecutor said they had recovered some of it from Ann's account, and the rest was being pursued through asset forfeiture. I thanked them and hung up. That evening, I got a text from Tom. He said Ann's house had sold and she had moved out of state. He said the new owners seemed nice, and they had already introduced themselves to the neighbors. I replied and said that was good news. Then I went outside and checked my mailbox. There was a newsletter from the HOA, and it included a message from Carl. The message said the board was committed to rebuilding trust, and they welcomed feedback from homeowners. It also said the reimbursement process was open, and over 30 homeowners had already submitted claims. The total reimbursement amount was projected to be $12,000. I folded the newsletter and went back inside. The cold case was closed. A few weeks after that, Rebecca called me with a final update. She said the HOA had settled with the Muellers, and they had received a full reimbursement for the missing special assessment funds plus interest. She also said the prosecutor's office had offered Ann a plea deal, and she had accepted it. The deal included restitution, probation, and a ban from serving on any HOA board in Ohio. Rebecca said it was a good outcome, and it sent a message that HOA board members could not operate above the rules. I thanked her for everything, and I asked what I owed her for the final work. She said the HOA's settlement check had covered it, and we were even. I said I appreciated it. She said if I ever had another HOA problem, I should call her immediately. I said I hoped I would never need to, but I was glad to know she was there. Then I hung up and sat on my couch. The binder was still on my coffee table, and I flipped through it one more time. Every document, every screenshot, every highlighted page told the same story: selective enforcement, fake notices, missing money, and retaliation. And it all came down because I kept receipts and refused to back down. The final piece came a month later when the board held a vote on new enforcement guidelines. The meeting was in the same clubhouse, and the turnout was even higher than before. Carl presented the new guidelines, which included mandatory system logging for all notices, a 14-day cure period for all violations, a formal appeals process with neutral arbitration, and annual audits of enforcement actions. The guidelines also included a provision prohibiting board members from coordinating with vendors without board approval. Carl said the guidelines were based on feedback from homeowners, and he thanked me specifically for bringing the issues to light. The room voted to approve the guidelines unanimously. After the meeting, Linda came over and said she had good news. She said the reimbursement process was almost complete, and over 50 homeowners had received checks. The total reimbursed amount was $14,000. She said it was the largest financial recovery in the neighborhood's history, and it would not have happened without my investigation. I said I was just trying to protect my own property, but I was glad it helped everyone. She said it was more than that, and the neighborhood was better because of it. Then she handed me a card. Inside was a note signed by 20 neighbors, thanking me for standing up to Ann and forcing accountability. I read it twice and put it in my wallet. Over the next few months, the neighborhood changed. The new enforcement guidelines were posted on the HOA portal, and every homeowner received a printed copy in the mail. Enforcement actions dropped by more than half, and the few violations that were issued followed the proper steps. The board hired a new management company with better transparency practices, and they posted monthly financial reports online. Tom was elected to the board, and he made it his mission to keep enforcement fair and consistent. Richard came to a few meetings and offered advice, but he said he was done with HOA politics for good. I understood. Linda started a neighborhood email list to keep everyone informed about board decisions, and it became the main communication channel. The email list had over 200 subscribers, and people used it to share updates, ask questions, and hold the board accountable. It felt like the neighborhood had finally woken up. The legal case against Ann wrapped up in the fall. She pleaded guilty to theft and fraud, and she was sentenced to 2 years probation and full restitution. The prosecutor's office recovered most of the missing money, and the HOA used it to fund new community projects. The board installed better lighting near the mailbox clusters, repaired the sidewalks, and planted trees along the main road. Every project was approved by a vote, and every expense was documented in the financial reports. It was a different HOA than the one I had moved into, and it felt like a place I could actually live without constantly looking over my shoulder. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when Tom walked over. He said he had something to show me. He pulled out his phone and opened a video. It was a doorbell camera clip from Ann's old house, recorded the day she moved out. The clip showed her loading boxes into a moving truck, and at one point she looked directly at the camera and said something under her breath. Tom had enhanced the audio, and you could hear her say, "If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA." We both laughed. Tom said it was the perfect ending, because her own words came back to haunt her. I said it was poetic justice. Then Tom said the board was planning a neighborhood event to celebrate the new guidelines, and they wanted me to say a few words. I said I would think about it. He said think fast, because the event was next weekend. I said I would be there. The neighborhood event was held at the clubhouse on a Saturday afternoon. The board set up tables with food, and someone brought a speaker for music. Kids were running around and neighbors were talking in groups. It felt more like a block party than an HOA meeting, and that was the point. Carl opened with a short speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition, and he introduced the new board members. Then he called me up to the microphone. I walked to the front with my notes, but when I got there, I folded them up and put them in my pocket. I said I did not have a prepared speech, but I wanted to say thank you. I thanked Tom for sharing the old complaint and standing with me. I thanked Linda for rallying the neighbors and pushing for accountability. I thanked Richard for his courage 3 years ago, even though it did not pay off at the time. I thanked Rebecca for her legal guidance and for believing the case was worth fighting. And I thanked everyone in the room for showing up to meetings, asking questions, and refusing to accept enforcement without transparency. I said the neighborhood was stronger because people cared, and that was worth more than any fine or settlement. The room applauded, and I stepped away from the microphone. Carl shook my hand and said the board was lucky to have me as a homeowner. I said I was lucky to have neighbors who gave a damn. After the event, I went home and sat at my kitchen table. The binder was still on the shelf, and I pulled it down one last time. I flipped through the pages and I thought about how close I had come to just paying the fine and moving on. If I had done that, Anne would still be running her fake enforcement system, the missing money would still be missing, and the neighborhood would still be under her control. But I did not pay the fine. I kept receipts. I asked questions. I gathered evidence. I hired an attorney. I reopened the cold case. And I caught her. The binder was proof that one person could make a difference, even in a place as small and bureaucratic as a homeowners association. I closed the binder and put it back on the shelf. Then I went outside and checked the mailbox. There was a letter from the management company. It was a notice of the annual meeting, scheduled for next month. The agenda included a vote on new board members, a review of the annual budget, and a discussion of future community projects. I marked the date on my calendar and went back inside. The HOA was far from perfect, but it was better. And that was enough. A few months later, I was at the gym opening up for the morning shift when my phone buzzed. It was a news alert from a local Cleveland station. The headline said former HOA president sentenced in theft case. I clicked the link and read the article. It covered Anne's case, the missing funds, the reimbursement process, and the new enforcement guidelines. The article included a quote from Carl saying the board was committed to transparency and accountability. It also included a quote from the prosecutor, saying HOA board members had a fiduciary duty to homeowners, and violations of that duty would be prosecuted. The article ended with a note that over 50 homeowners had been reimbursed, and the total recovery was over $14,000. I saved the article and sent it to Rebecca. She replied with a thumbs up and a note that said, "Well done." Then I put my phone away and started my shift. The gym was quiet that morning, and I had time to think. I thought about the night Anne showed up on my driveway with a fake notice. I thought about the moment I compared the old and new notices and saw the backdated signature. I thought about the meeting where Anne stormed out, and the audit that confirmed everything I suspected. And I thought about the fact that the cold case was not really cold anymore. It was solved. The money was recovered, the guilty party was held accountable, and the neighborhood was better for it. That afternoon, I stopped by Tom's house to return a tool I had borrowed. He invited me in and we sat in his living room. He said the board was planning to dedicate a section of the new community website to transparency, and they wanted to include a timeline of the enforcement reform process. He asked if I would be okay with them using my case as the example. I said I was fine with it as long as they did not use my name. He said they would keep it anonymous. Then he said something I did not expect. He said the board was planning to pass a resolution at the next meeting, formally thanking me for my efforts and recognizing the impact of the investigation. I said that was not necessary. He said it was absolutely necessary, because what I did changed the culture of the neighborhood and people needed to see that standing up for what was right had consequences. I said I appreciated it, but I did not do it for recognition. He said he knew that, and that was exactly why they wanted to recognize me. I thanked him and left. On the drive home, I thought about what he said. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because Anne handed me a fake notice, and I refused to accept it. I did it because I had a filing cabinet full of old documents, and I knew how to connect the dots. I did it because I kept receipts, and receipts do not lie. The resolution passed at the next board meeting. Carl read it aloud, and it included a summary of the investigation, the audit findings, and the reforms that followed. It did not mention my name, but it thanked the homeowner who initiated the records request and pursued accountability. The room applauded, and I stayed in my seat. After the meeting, several people came over to shake my hand even though the resolution was anonymous. Linda said everyone knew it was me, and they were grateful. Richard said he wished he had your persistence 3 years ago. Tom said the neighborhood owed me a debt, and he hoped I knew that. I said I was just glad it worked out, but the truth was, I did know. I knew because every time I checked the HOA portal, I saw new financial reports and transparent meeting minutes. I knew because every time I walked to the mailbox, I saw neighbors talking and laughing instead of whispering and complaining. I knew because the enforcement coordinator position was now filled by a board member who followed the rules, and every notice was logged, documented, and appealable. I knew because Anne was gone, and the system she built was dismantled piece by piece. And I knew because the next time someone in this neighborhood gets a questionable notice, they will have a roadmap for how to fight it. That roadmap is in a binder on my shelf, and it is available to anyone who asks. The final irony came a few weeks later. I was walking to my car when I saw a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My first thought was another fake notice, and my stomach dropped. But when I pulled it out, I saw it was a flyer for the neighborhood yard sale. I laughed and put it in my pocket. Then I got in my car and drove to work. On the way, I passed Anne's old house. The new owners had repainted the shutters and planted flowers in the front yard. It looked better than it ever had under Anne's ownership. I thought about the doorbell clip Tom had shown me where Anne muttered her catchphrase one last time before leaving. If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA. She was right about one thing. This neighborhood did have an HOA, but it was not her HOA anymore. It was ours. And we were not going to let anyone weaponize it again. A few months after that, I got a call from a homeowner in a different subdivision. She said she had heard about my case through a friend, and she was dealing with a similar situation. Her HOA was issuing fines without proper documentation, and the board was stonewalling her records requests. She asked if I had any advice. I said yes. I said keep receipts. I said document everything. I said do not pay fines you did not earn. I said hire an attorney if you can afford it. I said find allies in your neighborhood. I said do not back down, even when they try to intimidate you. And I said if the board is hiding something, it is probably bigger than you think. She thanked me and said she was going to follow my example. I wished her luck and hung up. Then I thought about how many other neighborhoods were dealing with Annes of their own. How many fake notices were being delivered right now? How many homeowners were paying fines they did not owe because it was easier than fighting? How many cold cases were buried in filing cabinets, waiting for someone to reopen them? I did not have answers to those questions, but I knew one thing for sure. If you keep receipts, if you ask questions, and if you refuse to accept selective enforcement, you can win. It will not be easy. It will not be fast, but you can win. And when you do, the neighborhood will be better for it. The board held another event in the spring, this time to celebrate the completion of the community projects funded by the recovered money. The new lighting was installed, the sidewalks were repaired, the trees were planted, the clubhouse got a fresh coat of paint. And the financial reports were posted online for everyone to see. Carl gave a speech thanking the homeowners for their patience and participation. And he said the neighborhood was in the best financial shape it had been in years. Tom gave a short speech about the importance of transparency, and he said the board was committed to maintaining the reforms. Linda gave a speech about community engagement, and she encouraged everyone to stay involved. And then Carl called me up one more time. I walked to the front, and he handed me a framed copy of the resolution the board had passed. He said it was a thank you and a reminder that accountability mattered. I took the frame and looked at it. The resolution was printed on official HOA letterhead, and it included the date, the vote, and the summary. I thanked Carl and the board, and I said I was proud to be part of a neighborhood that cared about doing the right thing. Then I went back to my seat, and the event continued. That night, I hung the frame on my wall next to the binder. The binder was the evidence, the frame was the result. Together, they told the whole story. A story about a fake notice, a cold case, a pattern of misconduct, and a fight for accountability. A story about keeping receipts, asking questions, and refusing to back down. A story about a neighborhood that woke up and took back control. And a story about the fact that one person with a binder and a backbone can make a difference. I sat on my couch and looked at the frame. Then I thought about Anne, wherever she was. I thought about the moment she handed me that first notice and the moment she stormed out of the meeting. I thought about the funny karma beat where her own clip proved the opposite of her claim. The moment when the doorbell footage showed her surveilling my house while pretending to enforce rules she had fabricated. I thought about how the HOA issued a memo clarifying the rule Karen weaponized, and how Karen stormed out when the vote went against her and everyone saw it. I thought about the public censure motion read aloud while Karen tried and fails to interrupt, and how satisfying it was to watch her lose control in front of the entire neighborhood. And I thought about one sentence: "Go ahead and call whoever you want. I have a committee for that." She said that to me early on, and it came back to bite her when the committee turned against her and the prosecutor's office opened a case. Boomerang. I smiled and turned off the light. The case was closed, the neighborhood was safe, and I had my receipts to prove it. Glad you stayed for the whole story.